Kitties, I've decided, after getting this book, it's time for story time. Historical lessons, brought to you by Malcolm Harris. This is about California in the late 1840s, 1850s. Gold rushers were not really settlers. At least most of them didn't think of themselves that way. They were there to stack up gold and go back or onward rich. Even after the state's inaugural constitution, itself a rogue affair, and California's quick incorporation as a free state to balance Texas in the Compromise of 1850, the men weren't coming to stay, and their behavior reflected that. Remember the context of this situation. This is right after the Mexican War. Greed and opportunism were an unstable basis for a society. But a war of all against all wasn't good for business either. If you spent your time jumping claims, in other words, getting fights with people because you thought your claim was first, you never got any gold. Everyone's too busy fighting. In the frontier camps, miners formed crude protocols for collective governance, immortalized in Charles Howard Shinn's 1885 account. Mining Camps, a study in American frontier government. Okay, 1885 this was written. These temporary associations of free men settled property disputes and kept retaliatory violence between the guys under control. Understand what's going on here. But this was Anglo-Californian self-government, and that hardly described the massive miners. Gold was nearly universal everywhere in the world. It had value. And people came in large numbers from anywhere they could. French adventurers, Chinese fortune seekers, experienced miners up from Chile and the northern Mexican region of Sonora. All these people are coming up here. Not just people from the East Coast, not just people from Texas or the old Northwest, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, or not people coming through St. Louis, going over the Oregon Trail, okay? Difficulties with such foreigners were inevitable, Sheen writes, the guy who wrote that 1885 account. And they only served to weld the Americans into a closer union. You're competing with all these people showing up at the same place to make money. And guess what? Excluding foreigners and Indians from gold claims became a raison d'etre, reason of being, for the minor councils and then for the Golden State government itself. This is the national beginning of California's history as an American state. It had a history long before that included the Indians, the Spanish bureaucracy, which was very sparse, but it did bring the church. The Spanish church was here as a institution of the government. And we're talking 1600s, 1700s. Then Mexico became the default government after they broke with Spain in the early 1800 revolutions. Well, they call them revolutions, but you could just call them changes of government, where instead of being governed by this European nation, you're being governed by the people in your own country. That's what happened all across Latin America and up to Mexico in the early 1800s. So after that, it became Mexican, and Mexico was still trying to figure itself out, so it had even worse connection with the western states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas. So Americans trying to go west took advantage. And here is the next paragraph. From the beginning, The state of California was a whiteness cartel, defining national belonging in relation to territorial access. In 1850, the state passed the Foreign Miners Tax Act, assessing a monthly rent for access to the land, putting everyone else at a comparative disadvantage. It wasn't a bad deal for, say, French miners who could, for a fee, secure claims that in former days the Anglos might have simply bullied them off. But the protections didn't apply universally. So there's this law, 1850, passed, that meant if you're going to get access to land, you got to pay a rental fee, which gave you legal claim if you paid the fee, and so you couldn't just be bullied or pestered by these militia groups that started forming. Next sentence. The state's civil and criminal procedural codes excluded testimony from Indians and black people in cases involving white people. French people were white. The testimony between the age of empire... I flipped too far. The testimony ban ensured that non-whites could not protect themselves from white predation, that they had no claim a white man was bound to respect. This happened in the South. Black people couldn't testify against white people. So if a white person did something untoward towards a black person, and the only witnesses were black people, they couldn't testify, and therefore that gave white people the right to do whatever they wanted. Now, if a white person testified, that person would be subject to ridicule or worse, violence. This happened in the South throughout this time period. This is before the Civil War. This is 1850. This is in California. In 1853, this is in California. In 1853, George Hall appealed his conviction for the murder of miner Ling Sing, a Chinese immigrant, to the California Supreme Court, and the judges ruled for Hall, concurring in a ruling full of bizarre race signs that the Chinese were also ineligible to testify against whites. That was the law. But because, this is the reason judge gave, to allow them to do so opened the door to full civic equality. So this man, who everyone knew killed this Chinese man for whatever reason, you could look this up, 1853, George Hall, Ling Sing, Lingsing, was able to get off because the witnesses were Chinese. And there was no other witnesses, apparently. This is what happened in California around 1850. The result was that California's whites were legally permitted to kill non-whites as long as no other whites complained. Mining camp governance in the state it birthed didn't simply quell violence, it stoked it, focused it, and organized it along racial lines, which is amazing. And it gets worse. I got 2 more paragraphs to read. With the state endorsing white supremacy by statute, American miners turned their attacks on the Indians into a national mission. In the decades following the gold rush, these settlers murdered and plundered on their country's behalf, organizing themselves into Indian hunting militias that demanded payment from the state, which in turn demanded reimbursement from the feds. The synthesis between national power and grassroots initiative was similar to the one that drove the Bear Flag Revolt and Fremont's campaign, now with the additional state layer. John C. Fremont was the military attaché from the American government that came in and took California during the Mexican War. No, I won't get into that. You look it up yourself. It's called the Bear Flag Revolt. The first civilian governor of California, of California, Peter Burnett, explained in his 1851 State of the State address that, first civilian governor of California, 1851, State of the State address, quote, "The white man, comma, to whom time is money, comma, and who labors hard all day to create the comforts of life, comma, cannot sit up all night to watch his property, semicolon, after being robbed a few times, he becomes desperate, comma, and resolves upon a war of extermination." He provided direct support for the genocidal project with an 1855 law that assessed an annual 25-cent tax on all fighting-age white men who didn't join a militia. A tax the legislature doubled to 50 cents the next year. Okay, what does this mean? You don't want to join these militias going out and killing people? Guess what? We're going to tax you. 25 cents. That's a lot of money in 1855. Yeah, it's a lot of money. The big giveaway, however, was federal, and the federal got involved in this. In the 1855 Bounty Land Act offered 160 acres to any soldier or militia member who fought for 2 weeks or more. Predictably, California militias embarked on rinky-dink expeditions against unarmed Indians, killing a few at a time and confiscating land. With these land grants, settlers saw a future in California, and they advanced inland and north, driving an increasing number of tribal communities from territory that the militiamen then received in payment. The Bounty Land Act was prelude to the 1862 Homestead Act that got passed during the Civil War, which offered the same 160 acres to settlers who spent 5 years improving the land, drawing an equivalence with the 2 weeks of Indian killing. And the federal government sent hundreds of thousands of dollars to the state to pay for California's war debt. So in other words, federal money was being paid to the state, who paid it to the state militia, who formed themselves in order to kill Indians and take their land and get 160 acres. All for just doing 2 weeks. That's what had just happened. And who was involved in this? Thanks to the support of Louisiana Senator and future Confederate Secretary of State Jedidiah P. Benjamin. On the stolen land, miners planted wheat, barley, and oats. Not as valuable as gold, though similarly generic, but the population wasn't set up for a plantation economy. There weren't a lot of workers, and the people who came out here were interested in getting rich quick. And then there were other people, traders, and people who sailed ships and got involved in that marketing arrangement to cater towards these people, and they were the ones who formed communities and cities up and down the state, which I know. I haven't read this book yet. Let me continue reading this book. To become gentlemen farmers, the settlers needed laborers, and there weren't many around. As a result, even displaced Indians, who comprised the majority of potential wage workers, commanded high pay. The Anglos came to the same conclusion as the Swiss psychopath Johann Sutter did: forced labor, enslavement. That guy Sutter, who apparently gets credit for discovering there was gold, after he did his little sawmill, he gets all this acclaim. The dude was running away from debts and his wife and kids. And there's some evidence that he was a psychopath. I won't go into that, but that's why this author chooses to say the Swiss psychopath John Sutter. Okay? He considered forced labor and enslavement the things he would do with his workers. You can look that up. I'll finish and then we're done. While free workers commanded at least $1 a day, again, this is 1855, farmers could buy Indian captives from labor contractors, remember the little militia groups, for not much more than a month's wages. So you get to pay for these slave people who are terrified what you would normally pay a day for 30 days. While black slaves in the South sold for upwards of $1,000 each, planters could get kidnapped California Indians for under $100 per person. White women were nearly absent from the coast, and white men enslaved Indian women and children for domestic labor, including sex. Sick fucks. Militia campaigns drove Indians off their land into Anglo homes and fields. See what's happening? Slavery was illegal. Oh, yeah, we're free now. But so was Indian testimony. And in the early 1860s, now this is over 10 years, a decade of this happening, California's slave raiding peaked. 1850s, early 1860s, which along with technological improvements in mining and wheat agriculture finally drove down the price of Indian wage labor. So these Indians were becoming the slave wage labor servants in California from the 1850s to early 1860s. By 1870, now this is after the Civil War, scarcely 20 years since the initial rush, California settlers had destroyed 80% of the California Indians by one estimate, bringing the population from 150,000 down to 30,000, quite possibly the most extreme demographic disaster of all time, in the words of historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Commenting on the public abuse of one young Indian farm laborer who was dragged behind a horse in Mendocino County in 1865, a Sacramento reporter scoffed about the supposed ban on forced labor. So much for slavery in California. And that's ends our story time, people. Notice how much different that is from the storybook history you get in public high school.